Hello and welcome back to the inspiring channel where Kunle ministers spiritual edification and personal development. If you're joining us for the first time, take the next few seconds to click the subscribe and notification buttons so you can catch up with the others on the latest and on future updates. And really, clicking these buttons would of course not cost you any charges nor interrupt your video, so please do that and stay tuned as we get into the content for today. Today we want to continue to the third area of our discussion on world history. We have previously spoken about the language and the people, now it's time to talk about the lands. But just before that, there is a big question that should follow after the claims of the last parts of this series, and that is, if the true Hebrews look like this, like regular Africans, who then are the European or Turkish people in the land we call Israel in the Levant or so-called Middle East today? We have kept this question and its answers till now because our discoveries of the locations of historical lands reveal the identity of the people currently in Israel, so let's get straight into today's sharing. Now, can you remember Noah and his sons? The only family left alive after the cataclysm of the flood around 2350 BC? This man Noah divided the whole earth amongst his sons. One major landmark in his divisions as recorded in Scripture are the rivers. We would look at the two most popular of these rivers, namely, the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. These rivers, along with Gihon and Pishon, make the rivers that flow out of the Garden of Eden as recorded in Scriptures in Genesis 2 verses 10 to 14. Now if you were to type rivers Tigris and Euphrates on your online maps, you would probably find them in the region called the Middle East. But if you check Scriptures, you would see that these rivers showing on your search engine are in fact not the real scriptural rivers. To prove this, let us take a look at the Scriptures that narrate the event of Noah sharing or dividing the earth amongst his sons and his sons' sons some years after the worldwide cataclysm. In Genesis 10 verses 21 to 25, the Scripture reads, "Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born. The children of Shem, Elam, and Ashur, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. And the children of Aram, Uzi, and Hul, and Gether, and Mash. And Arphaxad begot Sulla, and Sulla begat Eber. And unto Eber were born two sons, the name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan." The Hebrew word Peleg means to split or divide, and this is not the Pangea or continental drift theory, proposed in 1912, a period between the colonization of Africa and the start of World War I, which has now been pushed into movies, cartoons and media as fact. Peleg is talking about a patriarch dividing and sharing lands amongst his sons. We have put this quick side note here because science has been used as a scapegoat to push a lot of agenda and has been first perverted and then presented as a substitute for God and the facts of Scriptures. Because you would notice that along with this Pangea idea comes the idea of dinosaurs, another scapegoat, or scape lizard you may say, which are said to be dead and extinct millions of years ago, but we know there are such animals described in the book of Job such as the Leviathan and Behemoth, and there have been fairly recent dinosaurs' bodies found in the earth. Because if you look closely, the truth is that the real battle here is creation versus evolution, good versus evil. Let's not digress too much, let's go back to the second Scripture, but just let your children know as they play with those dinosaur toys that dinosaurs are created by Yahweh on the 5th and the 6th days, that they are part of the animals in Noah's Ark, and if they are extinct now, they simply died because the creation is groaning and dying because of sin, not because of the so-called GW or CC showing on your screen now. Problems which are said to be solved by calculating the amount of air people are breathing, called CO2, taxing people for clean air zones and pushing for electric cars that use batteries made with cobalt, which is mainly extracted from the Congo in Central Africa in very terrible conditions. Okay, enough of that, let's proceed. In Jubilees chapter 9 verses 4 and 5, we see the descriptions of the lands that came for two of the five the sons of Shem. The Scripture reads thus, And for Arpachshad came forth the third portion, all the land of the region of the Chaldees to the east of the Euphrates, bordering on the Red Sea, and all the waters of the desert close to the tongue of the sea which towards Egypt, all the land of Lebanon and Sanir and Amana to the border of the Euphrates. 5. And for Aram there came forth the fourth portion, all the land of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates to the north of the Chaldees to the border of the mountains of Ashur and the land of Arara. Now, if you know some geography, you listen to the scripture reading above carefully, and you want to try to locate the places the scripture is talking about using present-day maps, you would see immediately that there is a problem either with this scripture, which by the way was written literally thousands of years ago, or with the present-day descriptions of the locations and maps which were drawn just decades or at most a few centuries ago. In trying to solve this problem, you would see that the issue is with the present-day rivers Euphrates and Tigris. To demonstrate this and solve the above problem, first, we would try to locate Noah's land divisions by reading the scripture into the present day named rivers. In verse 4, it says the land for Arphaxad is to the east of Euphrates and borders on the Red Sea towards Egypt. Using today's Euphrates and the Levant, these would be opposite directions. Again, merging this with verse 5, you'll see the bigger problem. The land for Aram, the fourth son of Shem, is Mesopotamia, or Padan Aram. The scripture says this land is between Tigris and Euphrates. This is why they have given the land the Greek name Mesopotamia in the translations, which means between rivers. Now, the expansive land between the two rivers with these names in present-day Iran is simply unreasonably minuscule compared to the portion of the land being divided and the size of the land the other sons of Shem got. Because remember, the land being divided here altogether is literally the whole earth. The present-day locations and landmarks are therefore not matching these scriptures. In our research, when we checked fairly older maps, texts, and references, we were able to see that the scriptural river Euphrates is the river Niger and the scriptural river Tigris is the river Nile, as they have been labeled in the KM map. Let us look at some of our sources for these claims. Reading from the National Geographic magazine, from the National Geographic Society, Washington 1888 to 1959. In this kingdom of Amenuan, there enters a branch of the river Euphrates, Niger. The Frere does not confuse this with the Mesopotamian Euphrates, but assumes two rivers with the same name. And just ahead it reads, when I crossed this great river, I first made a long journey along its banks, which are very populous, referring evidently to the river Benue, a tributary of the Niger. Next, we see on the Guillaume de Lisle map of Northwest Africa, which is dated 1707, where the river Niger is named Euphrates, spelt with an F anyway, as against the Greek way with a PH. We can also see that land is labeled Judah, who is the son of Jacob or Israel and the father of the Jews. And you know the difference in all of these nomenclature if you remember the disambiguation we did in one of the previous parts of this series. This land is the same referred to as Wida or Wida in Benin Republic today, which till date has deep spirituality but not for the worship of Yahuwah or Yahweh, but is currently known for idolatry, snake worship. And we see on another map, the Bolton and Anvil wall map of Africa, dated 1794, the place called Tigris, where the river Tigris is and where the people still speak Tigrinya till today, which again is a Shemitic or Semitic language, a language relating to Shem as we explained in part 1 of this series. Actually, the place is still in Eritrea today. And that should remind us that almost all of Africa was colonized by some countries in Europe, and the names of the countries have been changed, some more than once. So looking at the KM map and reading the two verses again, this means all the land of the region of the Chaldees to the east of the Euphrates, bordering on the Red Sea, and all the waters of the desert close to the tongue of the sea which towards Egypt is talking about this region here. Similarly for verse 5. All the land of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates to the north of the Chaldees to the border of the mountains of Ashur is just about this region here. This immediately solves the opposite direction problem we saw in verse 4 and the size problem we saw in verse 5 when we used the present-day rivers Euphrates and Tigris. So far, we have mentioned three landmarks, Euphrates, Tigris and Mesopotamia, which itself is literally the region between the two rivers. We will talk more about Mesopotamia later, but just before that, we need to show you other important locations, because claiming that these three locations are in the continent as we have shown it on the KM map, has very grave historical implications, as this changes everything about the narrative of locations of historical scriptural events as we have always seen it. This means you would need to do your own research to convince yourself of this fact, and to make this easy, we have dedicated a video on how to use the KM World History Map. In it you would find just about all the links to the materials used to come to these conclusions and more, in one place. The next real locations we can see are closely listed together in Genesis 10 verses 8 to 10. This scripture reads, "And Cush begat Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. 9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. 10. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. The places we want to look at in this verse are Babel, Akkad, Calneh, and Shinar. Now, Babel, which is Babylon, can be found here, and the references W and X are the Ptolemy, Claudius map of North Africa, dated 1561, and X is the Catalan Atlas map of North Africa showing Babylonia. This map is dated 1375. The fifth place is Akkad, which is spelt Akkad. For Akkad, there are two text references, the first is a book and the other is an article. The book is called A History of Sumer and Akkad. As you might want to read this book, it is good to know at the back of your mind that this book, just like the publishing of the idea of Pangaea, was written around 1910, during the period of the scramble for Africa and just before the First World War. The scramble for Africa was a period when, just as depicted in this real picture and rendering, 13 European countries and the United States met in Berlin around 1885 to agree on the rules of African colonization, and from 1884 to 1914, while the continent, Africa, was still in conflict, these countries took territories and power from the existing African states and peoples. And the First World War was 1914 to 1918, which is just after the major colonizations of Africa took place. So back to the book, it is clearly stated in this book that Akkad is the same as Agadez, and in our second reference, which is an article called The Curse of Agadez, referring to the same Akkad, it is written there that myths, in this case the narrow literature, have been taken as history. The caption in the article reads, "The narrow literature was a very popular genre in Mesopotamia, however, and often, it seems, the version of the past these stories presented came to be accepted as actual history." This is just as we stated in part 1 of this series when we were justifying the use of Scripture as accurate historical accounts, and of how many manuscripts and hieroglyphics were often spinning off to myths and legends. This is one example of such. Another thing to note about this work documented in the book is that it had to be completed by a soldier, a military officer. As it is stated in the book, our first reference for Akkad, the greater part of our knowledge of early Sumerian history has been derived from the wonderfully successful series of excavations carried out by the late M. de Sarzeck at Teo, between 1877 and 1900, and continued for some months in 1903 by Captain, now Commandant, Gaston Cross. This is a typical example of history written by those who won the wars. Wikipedia says a military officer was assigned because of the unrest in the so-called Middle East area. It is interesting how excavations were going on in the midst of civil unrest in the area at that time. Again, Wikipedia says the soldier excavated for some years, while this book, written much earlier, in 1910, about like 7 years after the British Museum excavations were completed, said the soldier worked for just a few months. The main point, however, we got from these two references, despite all the questionables, is that the writings in the artifacts refer to Agadez, which is same as Akkad, and Agadez is located here as it is on the KM map. In fact, all you need to do is go on your search engine and type "where is Agadez," it will take you to that spot, but if you type "where is Akkad," it will take you to the Levant where the artifacts were discovered. Even though we know there are quite some artifacts in the British and European museums today that were nicely taken from Africa, and the people have been asking for them back to no avail. And for Calneh, we thought that is it possible that Calneh, which is the same as Kolno in the Hebrew root, be the same as Kano in northern Nigeria just south of Agadez in Niger? Because as a matter of fact, speaking of Borno and Lake Chad, which are both neighboring regions to Kano, Borno a state in Nigeria actually, and reading from page 1 of a ResearchGate article, referenced in the video description, Babagana Abubakar states the name Borno was coined from the Arabic word Bahar, and the name Nuhu literally written as Bahar Nuhu, a combination of two Arabic words. Bar meaning sea and Nuhu referring to Prophet Nuhu, who is also referred to as Noah in the Holy Bible and the Holy Torah, Old Testament. And this Nigerian state, Borno, is one of the regions that share borders with Lake Chad, knowing that it is not uncommon for lands to be named after the owners or patriarchs, just like Padan Aram is for Aram, the land of Elam is for Elam, the land of Israel for Israel. Can it be a mere coincidence that this area of land apportioned for a part Chad has a place called Chad? Is this place not indeed the actual or of the Chaldees or Chades? Such that Kolno is Kano and the Chaldees Chald is Chad? Though Wikipedia says the name Chad is from a Kanuri word for lake, but on searching a list of Kanuri words relating to water bodies including lake, none of them sounded like Chad or even Cad with CH pronounced as a K. And don't forget, the Igbo people from the children of Eri, the tribe of Gad, are just in the southern part of the same Nigeria as we saw in the last part of this series. Could all these be coincidences? Number 5. Finally, Shinar, which is the same as Sinar or Shusha, is found here. The references are labeled B, D, K, L, and H6. For the sake of time we would just look at K, but for the L and H6, when you see L on the KM map reference, it means to look up on your search engine, and when you see the reference H, it means a Hebrew Strong's number. These are showing on your screen now. So the reference K is the James Rennell map of North Africa, dated 1742 to 1830. It shows Sennar in the present-day Sudan. This map also shows the river Tiger or Tigris. We started today's series by trying to answer a question, but for time's sake, we would not be able to get to the answer today. That question once again is, if the true Hebrews look like regular Africans, who then are the European or Turkish people in the land we call Israel in the Levant or so-called Middle East today? This would be the first thing we address in the next part of this series. It's been enough discoveries in one part. Let us end the video and summarize what we have learned from the very start of this series up until this point. You may want to make a note of this list as it has everything in one place and you can convince yourself of each point one after the other, and don't forget the notification button. You can click it now. Part 1. Languages similarities. There are striking similarities between the African languages and the Hebrew language. We looked at a few examples like the translations for the words what, peace, angel, and so on. These similarities with Hebrew are not found between languages of other continents. Part 2. Similarities in physical features. History points out that Jews or even Shemites altogether are mainly people of dark skin and other Negro-like features. Just like Joseph, Moses, and Paul, who are Hebrews, have all been mistaken for Egyptians, and we see in the depictions in the Lachish Relief Monument and the depictions of Israelite oppression in Egypt that Jews or Shemites in general are indeed like the Hamites. Whitewashings. Because of the Hellenization of history, attempts have been made to change this narrative in history, like changing the appearance of paintings, the scriptures being translated to Greek, and so on. Part 3. The worship of Yahweh, the God of creation, versus Hebrew-related or Hebrew-derived religions, like Roman Catholic Christianity. The Catholic Church has catechisms that are opposite scriptures and are incorporating a lot of pagan symbolism, because the source of the institution of the Catholic Church is by the Romans in an attempt to merge the worship of Yahweh with their pagan religions. Also, the Catholic Church did not stop the persecution of the followers of Yeshua, and they have strange doctrines and practices upheld till this day. Part 4. Pre-colonial and pre-missionary Israelite cultures and scriptures. There are Israelites' cultures and practices already existing in Africa before colonization and the arrival of the missionaries, like circumcision, purifications from menstruation, and so on in the Igbo culture. There are also writings of the Old Testament in Africa, written in African languages before the missionaries came. Just like it is said about the Ethiopian eunuch reading Isaiah and Philip explained to him, and also the autobiography of Olaudah Ekwino and the book, The Hebrewisms of West Africa. There are also existing descendants of Israel and other scriptural genealogies like the Igbo tribe of Gad, and the Yoruba tribes of Ephraim and Nimrod, whom they referred to as Lamarudu. We also read in the book Hebrewisms of West Africa how the Ashanti and other cultures were Hebrew in many aspects. Historically, we also know that the Catholic Church carried out torturings, killings, and eventual banishing of the Hebrews from Spain, through Portugal to São Tomé in West Africa, and then much later the descendants of these Hebrews were sold as slaves to America. Part 5, that is, today's part. Size and descriptions of the Padan Aram or Mesopotamia. The land Padan Aram or Mesopotamia, between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris as we see it in the Middle East, cannot fit into the scriptural descriptions. It would be contradictory in the directions of the landmarks mentioned, and it would be ridiculously small compared to descriptions in scriptures. But using the actual scriptural rivers, that is Niger as Euphrates and the Nile as Tigris as seen from older maps and references, solves the two above problems. We see that some important academic history was invented and written during wars by those winning the war and in war zones. And these parts of history were based literally on myths and legends. We proceeded then to search for and discover some more true locations like Babel or Babylon, which is around Egypt, Akkad, which is Agadez in present-day Niger, Shinar, which is Sinar in present-day Sudan, and so on. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to be notified when the next videos are released. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video. God bless you.
Lift your hands, yeah, I'm on your